Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're looking at a staggering, pulse-pounding 65 minutes that, quite literally, saved the American Revolution. It's an incredible story of grit, unlikely heroes, and just a massive military upset. And you know what the craziest part is? It wasn't pulled off by a professional army, but by ordinary folks who just absolutely refused to be intimidated. We're starting right in the thick of it, just 65 minutes. That is literally all it took for 900 completely unorganized frontiersmen, guys with no uniforms, zero formal training, and absolutely no orders from the Continental Army, to completely annihilate an undefeated British Loyalist army and kill their brilliant commander on October 7th, 1780. I mean, to put that into perspective, your morning commute probably takes longer than it took these farmers to completely alter the course of global history. So part 1, the British Southern Strategy. To figure out how such an impossible upset even happened, we first need to take a step back and look at the incredibly dire state of the revolution just a few months before this legendary clash. By the summer of 1780, the revolution was effectively on life support. The British had entirely shifted their strategy to pacify the South, and it was working. This led to the fall of Charleston in May 1780, which was hands down the worst American military disaster of the entire war. Then came August, where the Southern Continental Army was just absolutely obliterated at Camden. At that point, there was essentially zero organized American resistance left in the South. Which brings us to Section 2, Ferguson's fatal mistake. Enter Major Patrick Ferguson. Tasked by Lord Cornwallis to command the Loyalist militia on the western flank, Ferguson was exactly the guy the British needed. He was a 36-year-old Scottish officer, wildly ambitious, brilliantly skilled, and totally ruthless. And his resume was honestly incredible. He wasn't just some random officer. He was widely considered one of the absolute finest marksmen in the entire British Army. He'd even invented his own breech-loading rifle. He was incredibly effective at his job, too, transforming over 1,000 local farmers and shopkeepers into a highly disciplined, bayonet-wielding force. He basically marched through the Carolina backcountry, forcing rebels to swear loyalty to the crown or just sit back and watch their farms burn. But then, well, Ferguson made a catastrophic mistake. He looked further west to the fiercely independent frontier families living over the mountains and decided he needed to send them a message. So he released a paroled prisoner to deliver this incredibly blunt threat. If they didn't cease their opposition immediately, he would cross the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay waste to their settlements with fire and sword. So Section 3, the Over Mountain Men. Now, Ferguson obviously intended this threat to intimidate them into submission, but instead, these pioneers, who had literally spent years surviving in the harsh wilderness, took this direct threat to their homes and families as an absolute declaration of war. They quickly became known as the Over Mountain Men. Now consider the fascinating math of this matchup. On side A, you've got Ferguson's Loyalists, heavily disciplined, operating under a strict professional command structure, but armed with muskets that were really only effective up to about 80 yards. But on side B, you have the Over Mountain Men, literally zero chain of command, but they were wielding long rifles. These weapons were devastatingly accurate, capable of hitting targets from over 2 football fields away. It's a classic clash, right? 18th century professional warfare going up against rugged wilderness hunting tactics. Fueled purely by a massive personal grudge, roughly 1,400 of these frontiersmen mustered at Sycamore Shoals. They were totally unfunded. No official government was commanding them. They just grabbed their rifles, left their homes, and started a brutal, truly miserable march through the freezing rain and mud of the Blue Ridge Passes, simply to hunt down the man who threatened their families. But they ran into a snag. The frontiersmen were moving way too slowly, and they realized the highly mobile Ferguson might just escape and link back up with the main British army under Cornwallis. So the Patriot colonels made a massive gamble. They took their 900 fastest horsemen and sent them on an exhausting, rain-soaked night ride through the mud. They absolutely had to catch him before he slipped away. Which leads to Section 4, the Battle of Kings Mountain. Their gamble actually paid off. By the foggy morning of October 7th, they finally tracked Ferguson down. He had set up camp on a place called Kings Mountain, which was a 60-foot flat-topped ridge in South Carolina, completely covered in thick hardwood trees and brush. Now, Ferguson's hubris was absolutely peaking right about now. He made this infamous, boastful speech to his men, claiming that not even God Almighty himself could drive him from this hill. But in reality, the position he chose was a total tactical death trap against the very specific enemy he was about to face. The Over-Mountain men used a really simple but incredibly deadly three-step strategy. Since they didn't have any formal military training, they basically just treated it like they were hunting game. Step 1, surround the base of the mountain completely. Step 2, stalk uphill through the trees simultaneously from all sides. And Step 3, whenever the Loyalists launched a terrifying bayonet charge, just don't stand and fight. Melt back into the forest, reload, and creep right back up the hill. So this created an absolute nightmare scenario for Ferguson. It was honestly like pushing water uphill. Because the Loyalists were totally surrounded, every single time they charged downhill with their bayonets at one group of frontiersmen, they exposed their backs to devastating 200-yard rifle fire from the guys on the other three sides of the mountain. The fighting was just incredibly savage. Ferguson was conspicuously brave throughout all of it, riding back and forth across the ridge, frantically blowing a silver whistle to rally his crumbling lines. His sword was literally shot right out of his hand. His hat was shot off his head, yet he stubbornly refused to surrender to men he called a band of bandits. Finally, he gathered his officers for one last desperate horseback breakout down the hill, but he never made it. He was struck by multiple rifle balls simultaneously and dragged by his horse. The finest marksman in the British Army was dead. Let's just pause for a second to absorb these staggering numbers. In roughly 65 minutes, a smaller force of 900 totally untrained farmers entirely wiped out a fortified army of 1,100 trained Loyalists. Every single Loyalist was killed, wounded, or captured. Meanwhile, the Patriots lost fewer than 30 men. It is an absolutely staggering military anomaly. Moving on to Section 5, Turning the Tide. Following the battle, the frontier militias held a hasty court-martial, executed a few captured Loyalists for past crimes, and then, well, they just melted right back into the wilderness. They went home. But the historical shockwaves they left behind would fundamentally change the entire war. The immediate ripple effects were completely catastrophic for the British. The sudden, violent loss of his entire western flank just stunned Lord Cornwallis. He actually felt physically ill, halted his advance entirely, and retreated for 3 months. Loyalist recruitment in the Carolinas collapsed overnight, while Patriot morale surged. But most importantly, this massive delay gave the brilliant American general Nathaniel Greene the exact amount of time he needed to arrive in the South and set up his devastating guerrilla strategy.
Now, before we wrap this up, we have to explore one of the most mind-blowing what-ifs of the entire American Revolution. It's a wild twist of fate involving Major Ferguson himself, and it begs the question, what if the war had ended 3 years earlier? Let's rewind a bit to the Battle of Brandywine in 1777, so 3 years before Kings Mountain. Major Ferguson, being the elite marksman that he was, had an unsuspecting, high-ranking American officer right in his rifle sights. But Ferguson lowered his weapon. He outright refused to pull the trigger, writing later that he considered it unsportsmanlike to shoot an unsuspecting man in the back from an ambush. That unsuspecting officer was almost certainly George Washington. Just think about the historical irony here for a second. The exact same rigid, gentlemanly code of honor that saved George Washington's life in 1777 is exactly what got Ferguson killed at Kings Mountain, when his immense pride made him completely refuse to surrender to a group of frontiersmen he deemed beneath his station. Once Cornwallis's campaigns stalled out at Kings Mountain, the whole sequence of events became this almost inevitable, relentless march toward British exhaustion. General Greene bled the British forces dry at places like Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse, eventually forcing Cornwallis on a desperate march north into Virginia. And all of this ended exactly 1 year after Kings Mountain, in October 1781, with Cornwallis trapped and surrendering at Yorktown. Thomas Jefferson later called this very battle the turn of the tide of success. And honestly, he hit the nail on the head. Kings Mountain proved a vital, enduring concept that free citizens organizing themselves and fighting for their own families and their own land could completely break a professional military machine. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. History so often turns on the smallest hinges. How entirely different would the course of the American Revolution, and honestly the shape of the entire world today, be if those Over-Mountain men had simply ignored Ferguson's threat and stayed home in the woods? It's a pretty powerful testament to the fact that sometimes ordinary people pushed to their absolute limits are the ones who write history.